Hello and welcome to the Ahead of the Game podcast. I'm your host, James Oxford, and today we have Chris Filer and Alex West on the show to talk about the Houston Rockets. So, quick rundown on the Rockets this season. They finished 41 and 41, 20th in offensive rating and 9th in defensive rating, with a plus 1.1 net rating. Alex, what are your initial thoughts on what the process should be as the Rockets approach the draft in which they have the third overall pick?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea because this team, to me, is 2 years ahead of schedule from where they were. You bring in a guy like Ime Udoka who clicks with young guys. We saw what he did in Boston. We saw what he did this year in Houston. All of a sudden, they're defending, they're playing together. There's even been some life in Jalen Green, a prospect that a lot of people thought was just a complete wash at some points during his career. He's really come in and given this franchise a new direction. But with that, has come this idea that all of a sudden Houston is or should be in playoff competition. I think it's very likely next year we're looking at a team that is either in the playoffs or very very tough competition for a playoff spot. And I'm talking about top six. I'm not talking about getting into the play-in. I'm talking about a team that can make it in a Western Conference that is increasingly dangerous every single year with these teams. I think what this does, looking at this draft, you have the number 3 pick. If you're dedicated to this process, which obviously Houston is, has been rebuilding for some time, you are now looking at what might be the last high pick you have. And so there's an idea, and we're going to go through this, but I think there's an idea of who on the roster now stays. Who do you want to develop? But more importantly, what are these players? And I think guys like Jabari Smith, even Jalen Green, these questions come up. We know Amen Thompson's awesome, but we maybe don't know what he is. And so I think really this offseason is about framing who these players are a little bit ahead of schedule and just seeing what it is they can do. And so, I mean, James, I want to throw it back over to you because you're kind of the resident expert here. When you take a look at this roster, who are the pieces that you're very excited about building around? Who are the pieces that you want to stick around? Who are the salaries that kind of get moved out? I mean, there's just a lot of moving questions about this roster.
Yeah, great question. I think when you're talking about building blocks, the first name obviously that comes to mind is Alperen Şengün. He really showed up and came to play this season after kind of I don't want to say being snubbed the first two seasons, but clearly the previous coach wasn't kind of interested in that being the process or the individual they wanted to build around. But Şengün has come in, has remained positive. I think that's the most important thing. He didn't come in and grumble like some guys do. He really showed he can be that franchise cornerstone. Now, I don't mean to say that his game is flawless by any means. There are concerns over defensive fit in terms of a championship roster. I think he did go a long way to prove this year, they were a solid defensive team when he was on the court, that he can be a piece of the puzzle of a good defense. Now, what it comes down to is, do you surround him with the right pieces to insulate his weaknesses while kind of accentuating his strengths? Sorry, I can't speak. And then we get to the next piece I think that's really instrumental is Tari Eason. I know that's not necessarily the second name that comes on people's list when it comes to franchise cornerstones, and he's probably not going to be respected league-wide like a franchise cornerstone, but you already see guys like Draymond Green who have acknowledged kind of the impact he brings to games with his intensity, his kind of feel for the game is, I think, really underrated, which is somehow a knock on him, I think, coming into the draft, which was just absolutely insane. Going back to college, you see the impact he makes his team just play a lot better when he's on the court, and that's carried over to the NBA. So just looking at some stats real quick on Tari Eason, it really goes to show how much of a difference he makes when they were plus 1.7 on offense when he was on the court compared to when he was on the bench. They were over 9 points per 100 better on defense when he was on the court compared to when he was sitting. And that resulted in almost an 11-point net on off, which is really just superstar type impact. Now, I get it. He only played 22 games this season, so there may be some apprehension as far as, hey, is that a small sample size type thing? I mean, last year he was nearly at a +8 net on off, and that was a larger sample size. Not 36 minutes a game for 82 games, of course, but still, I think a sample size that we can begin to take seriously. And I think just kind of he is the perfect encapsulation of a Ime Udoka type player. And that's why I kind of see him as someone, given how much we've heard this offseason of they're looking for Ime type players. He is that player. And we'll get into later maybe draft fits that also fit that type of that archetype. But Chris, what are you thinking as far as building blocks and the next piece that you might look at?
Well, first off, I am thrilled to hear Tari Eason too. I wasn't expecting that. That's really interesting to me because I love Tari and the 104 games he's played this so far in his career are really exciting, even if it's not a lot of games. I think the most interesting guy besides those two is, and really the one that makes the whole thing still kind of fit so far, is Jabari Smith. I'm more excited about Amen Thompson, but I think Jabari is really the one that makes this puzzle work a little better because he is such a comfortable outside shooter. He's really willing to let it fly. And his versatility on defense, which I do believe in, and I'm not the Rockets expert you are, James, but I do like Jabari's overall kind of growth so far. He's still so young. I mean, he was such a young prospect when he came out. He's still very young at this point, and I like where he is. I think he's a good fit next to Tari, next to Sengun, next to whoever, because he can play. He can guard big wings. He can. He's not really a rim protector, but he can. He's a big boy for a guy as young as he is, and his overall offensive how comfortable he is. He's a 76th percentile spot up shooter at 20 years old, I believe. Maybe he's 21 now, but he's already above average catch and shoot. He's just a really kind of all around public player. I see his negative net on off is not great so far, but I think that's a lot of that is who he plays with more than anything, and I think he really does contribute to that successful Rockets defense this year.
Yeah, one thing I really want to kind of add in on Jabari is how much his rim finishing has improved since college. That was something I was really concerned about with him coming in to the NBA. Would he be someone who can finish at the rim? And I always kind of thought it was, once he puts on the muscle, fills out the frame, there's going to be more success at the rim. He hasn't even filled out the frame all that much, and he's already 63rd percentile at rim finishing at 1.24 points per shot. So, like, I 100% agree with you. He has shown improvement. I will say one concern I have about Jabari and on-off numbers are always, tricky to figure out with collinearity, things like that. Who are you sharing the floor with? Who are you not getting to share the floor with? Sometimes even more important. Uh, I will say they were 1.5 points worse on offense with him on the court versus sitting, and they were 6.5 points worse on defense with him on the court versus him sitting. And so there are concerns about, to me, he's a good player, yes. Is this system the right system for him? I think it could be, but he obviously there's something he's not doing on the court that some other players like Tari Eason, although that's not the sole explainer of his on-off numbers, because again, Tari Eason only played 22 games this season, so his impact is not going to be felt that heavily on other people's on-off numbers. But I will say that the improvement Jabari has made this season is awesome, but I am still a little bit apprehensive.
I think the other guy you got to really talk about here is, and this can go a lot of different directions, but is Jalen Green. Um, Even when Ime was in Boston, they ran a lot of pick and rolls. And, when you just off the cuff, if you're thinking about the Houston Rockets roster, you're thinking, well, probably Fred VanVleet running pick and rolls, but actually Jalen Green was the guy who ran the most pick and rolls for them this season. Um, he is a guy who was getting downhill, who was really kind of pivoting his game and learning to attack the rim a little bit better, more efficiently, and distributing in a way that I felt. So this is the kind of distinction. If you look at his stats, I feel like there was more advantage passing. Like he was creating more opportunities as opposed to just like dumping the ball off. So I think that's a really interesting perspective to take a look at this roster on, because you start to ask yourself, okay, well, where is the position of need? How do we fill a gap here? And I think a lot of that revolves around are the Rockets going to use Jalen Green as one of the central hubs of their offense going forward? I don't think that question's settled. And James, I think that's probably something for you to answer, but it certainly looked like it last year. That they were gearing up more towards using kind of a 2 guard system, getting some pick and roll stuff. Now they've pushed a lot in transition. That's what young teams do. But as they start to mature, there's going to have to be some evolution in the half court game. And certainly, if we look back at last year as the earmarker of what we're doing going forward, it feels like an on-ball pick and roll game is kind of where they're evolving to, and that's consistent with what Ime did in Boston as well. And so, I think Jalen Green becomes this really interesting player that you've got to just take a look at and say, well, is he a primary guard? Is he somebody we're comfortable doing all this with? And if that's the case, how does that shift into what we're looking at in this, with pick number 3? Is it a Reed Shepard? Is it a Rob Dillingham? Are we looking for a primary ball handler? Are we looking for a wing? How does all that fit with Amen Thompson, who certainly showed a proclivity for being able to handle the ball as well? And so I think he has not necessarily answered. I think there's a lot of good things that happened this year, certainly better than all the 2 years previously for Jalen Green. But I think he's created some questions moving forward that I don't think there are necessarily easy answers for. What do you think, James?
Yeah, the thing with Jalen Green that really is starting to get under my skin is the inconsistency, where it seems like every single season he started off slow. Rookie season, you start off slow, that's fine. It's to be expected. It's the learning curve. Sophomore season, again, not unheard of. Sometimes, especially, you really start to get a feel for the game. I think about a year and a half in, and that's why you see sometimes these second-year players kind of have these big post All-Star breaks, and if their team is a playoff team, then that's when sometimes you'll see them really start to show out as the All-Star superstar they might be. Jalen Green has so far every single year after the All-Star break decided, hey, I'm going to turn it on now. And if you're going to be getting the money that I think he expects to get, which I'm very apprehensive about giving to him, then you have to be an 82 gamer. I'll at least say a 65 game a season player. I'm not necessarily saying you got to play all 82 and be a superstar in all of them. I don't want to set that standard, but the current amount of games he's bringing it per season is not going to cut it. And if the Rockets are looking at contracts this offseason as far as extensions, Şengün, I think, has earned his max extension, maybe twofold over. Jalen Green, I'm definitely not there with. I think if they are going to lock him up long term this offseason, especially with the new media deal coming out, I'm not exactly sure what that is going to look like with a $7 billion media deal in tow. I would be, if I'm the Rockets, I'm thinking, hey, you got to at least show us you can play in November and December before we start handing out the big bucks to you. If not, then maybe he is either traded, which I don't necessarily know that's the right decision. I know there's been talks about players they could package him for this past trade season. Mikal Bridges was the name that was being discussed, along with obviously the Rockets on a lot of Nets picks. There's been reports about the Rockets maybe preferring the Suns picks. I personally wouldn't prefer the Suns picks, but I'm not going to argue with reports given that I don't have sources myself. So I think that Jalen Green is, like you said, not a solved problem by any means. But I will say, though, the 1 month he gave us this season was a very impressive month. I don't want to take that away from him. One more guy I really want to touch on that I think was huge this season, and he's a vet that I'm not going to say gets overlooked, but Fred VanVleet was just an absolute dynamite player for the Rockets this season. When you look at his synergy numbers, they just really pop off the page. The Rockets as a team were 5.5 points per 100 better with him on than they were off. He was in the 80th percentile for pick and roll ball handler, including passing, at 1.05 points per possession. Now, that's not like a number that you're going to get from a great transition player or something like that as far as points per possession, but not every possession can be a transition possession. You can realistically make most possessions a pick and roll possession, and if that's your baseline for your offense, then that's a solid baseline. To add into that, he was 77th percentile in spot up points per possession, 64th percentile in handoffs, 76th off screen, although that's not something the Rockets did a ton of. And then you get into the catch and shoots, and again, he was there, great there as well. The big hiccup to his game, obviously, is the rim efficiency, 4th percentile at the rim in scoring. And I mean, I don't really see that improving all that much. It's always been a weakness for him. So I've been rambling on, I feel like here. Chris, Why don't you stop me from talking for a little bit here? And what's your next thought on the Rockets?
I do want to quickly, real fast, go back to Jalen Green for one split second because you mentioned it right at the end there. You were talking about the inconsistency, and you mentioned the one good month. I just want to bring these crazy numbers up because he in February was a negative 8.4 over 12 games, and in April was a negative 8.6. In this crazy March, he was a positive plus 15.1 when he was on the court, shooting suddenly almost 50% from the field and almost 41% from three, despite over the season not being anywhere near those marks. So it's this one crazy month, and it's so unfortunate that it's almost at the end of the season because it's harder to glean as much. If it had happened in December, you could watch a lot of the habits for a lot longer and figure out what was going on. But at the end of the year, doing that drives you crazy because now we have to wait a bunch. All the games were just at the end of the year, and the end of the NBA season is chaos. So it makes it so hard. But the two guys we haven't really talked about so far, and the Fred VanVleet stuff is really important for them. He's been so critical. Amen Thompson is someone we haven't really talked about. Amen, as Alex mentioned at the beginning, is someone who's clearly awesome, but maybe we don't know exactly what he's going to be long term. He seems like the defense is fantastic. He's just an unbelievable athlete. He's great vision offensively and defensively. For where he is on defense at this point, you can only be thrilled. And offensively, I've just never seen a player that I am more confident won't be able to shoot long term than Amen Thompson. It just looks crazy, the shot, and it always has. And I guess it looks better than it did when he was a prospect, but it's just not good looking. It's not to a point that's usable. 14% from three is unbelievable. And he is on offense. What he is a wonderful athlete who, despite being about 6'7", can just play in the dunker spot. And because he's such a good finisher, he can be involved in pick and roll because he's a really good passer. The handle needs work, obviously, but it's not horrible for a 20-year-old. So I mean, he's just a good basketball player at this point, and that's what kind of the Rockets are full of good basketball players. It's so interesting because when we're evaluating them, and we're going to talk about that in a second when we finish going through the actual guys. The Rockets are such a positionless team because the talent across the board, height, weight, whatever, is just good basketball players. It's not about this guy's the center, this guy's the power forward, this guy's the whatever. I really do think when we're approaching the Rockets team building, they've just been able to put so many good basketball players on the court that it's about fitting the puzzle pieces together. And luckily, they've got a coach who I think can really do that.
Well, I guess that means now it's time to turn to the other side of the equation. We've really gone through what the Rockets have done this season and how they're improving. And now we need to flip it over. We need to talk about the draft because there are a lot of prospects that people aren't overly excited about. This is maybe not the draft you want the third pick in, but here we are. And as I said, this may be the last time they're picking this high. So it comes down to this one sort of singular question that branches out in a million spider webs. And James, I'm going to frame this up for you because you're the guy who really can do this. You have different kinds of players. And I think the assumption here is that Alex Sarr and Reece Shea are going to be gone. That seems to be the consensus opinion. Of course, it's May 26th with a lot of time to go before the draft. That may change, but I think that's the assumption that we're operating under. So then you have this entirely different set of people. You've got a guy like Reed Shepherd who can play both guard spots. You've got Topic, who's a little bit more of an on-ball guy. You've got Klingon, you've got Holland, you've got Castle, Connect, all these different sorts of dudes who fit in different holes in what maybe the Rockets are trying to do. But I think it comes down to this question: what are they missing? What do they need? And maybe more importantly than that, who fills the biggest need if there's not one thing in particular?
Another great question, Alex. So I went over a few numbers for the Rockets earlier. Let me go through a few more that I think are kind of telling and where they need that help. So when you look at the four factors, I'm a big four factors guy when it comes to analyzing basketball. And the Rockets were actually really good at two of the four, I should say eight. Two of the eight factors. You have four on offense, four on defense. fifth in turnover percentage offensively, so they did a really good job not turning the ball over. And they were fifth in defensive effective field goal percentage, which again means you didn't let the other team score. Now, they were rather average at four of them, and then two of them they were awful at. They could not stop the opponent from getting to the free throw line. I don't think that's an issue you can solve with a draft pick. But then you get to the one they can at least, sort of look at is the 27th in league ranking for their own effective field goal percentage. They couldn't put the ball in the basket at a high enough rate. That's what it came down to. They were 21st in spot up points per possession, 23rd in transition points per possession, 28th on cuts, which I think goes to show that teams weren't respecting their shooters, and so the back cuts just weren't there. Because they obviously have a guy who can hit those cuts. Şengün, who's one of the best in the game at it. And so what player kind of addresses that need that you were talking about, which is putting the ball in the basket at a high efficiency? That's Reed Sheppard. At the end of the day, that's Reed Sheppard. Synergy has him in the 100th percentile, which isn't technically possible, but 100th percentile for spot up. Transition, he was 70th percentile. Pick and roll ball handler, he was 93rd percentile. Handoffs, which I think is something that really plays in well with Şengün, 52nd percentile. Off screens is not something he was asked to do. It's not something the Rockets did a lot last year either. But if they were to start incorporating those type of off screen actions, I do think that's something he could excel at as well.
I think one of the things about Reed Sheppard that really does add to this sort of complex tapestry that you're weaving here, James, is the idea that he's a good secondary passer. Playing with Dillingham, there's a question of like who was the lead guard, and I think Sheppard played off the ball a lot. That actually plays into something I think is very helpful. The Rockets had three guys over 3 assists this year. The ball moved a lot. You saw Amen Thompson even play a little bit of that lead initiator role. Having guys who can relocate, as you hit on with the Reed Sheppard thing, being a relocation piece, using their gravity to do that, but also being that secondary ball mover just makes the offense more potent as it sort of emphasizes that everyone is dangerous. Sheppard averaged 5.6 assists, something like that this year. And so that number comes in and it really adds to what is already happening, this sort of bounce around ball movement thing. And I think that's a sort of underrated part of his game. Now, I think it introduces questions that we've talked about all over is, Van Vliet's not a big guy. Sheppard's not a big guy. Some small wingspans there, maybe not the best of defenders. We saw Van Vliet play pretty well against Steph Curry, but this has been years ago, so that's many, many miles ago. So if you're going to be one of these teams who can play in the playoffs, how do you, with a rotation of Jalen Green, Reed Sheppard, and Fred Van Vliet, look to defend these bigger guards who are in the Western Conference and even beyond as this team starts to grow?
Yeah, I think that you have to count on some of your other players in some situations. You have Tari Eason, who again, monster defender, huge hands, high activity level, really thrives at creating chaos, something that Reed Sheppard does as well. So pairing them together along with the next guy, Amen Thompson, I think really is just like setting up the Rockets for a situation where there's so much chaos being created that their half court offense is really going to be almost, I'm not going to say secondary, but like a sideshow to the transition. And then when you get to defensively, how do they allow for someone like Sheppard to play next to Fred Van Vliet? Size-wise, that's what you do. You create the chaos. So offenses oftentimes nowadays are trying to get that switch, trying to get that mismatch in the playoffs. That's the name of the game in the playoffs. You get the switches. So I think you really just have to ramp up the aggressiveness in terms of strategies. Anytime you see screens, we're not switching, we're trapping, things like that. Now you can't do that every time because it becomes, easy to predict, easy to game plan around. But you have to throw different looks in like that to really dissuade teams from going mismatch hunting. When to get the mismatch, you have to take a risk. It becomes a lot less appealing.
Chris, I want to reframe this back to you. Listen to what James is saying, which makes a ton of sense. It does feel a little bit like there are 6 starters. Like when we start to add somebody in, we're going to have to move people around. Is it going to be Sheppard, Green, Van Vliet, Thompson, Eason, Şengün? So now we're at 6. How do you sort of look at that as you move forward and as you get into like what this playoff rotation is going to be and making that decision? How much does that idea that you could pick maybe 2 of these guys off defensively concern you as you look at Sheppard as a prospect?
It definitely concerns me. I think you're absolutely right. I do think when we're talking about the Rockets making a draft pick here, even though they are 2 years ahead of schedule, and I agree with you on that. I'm pleasantly surprised by how much they improved over the last year. Fred VanVleet's only got this year and one more year on the contract. He's already 30 years old. I wouldn't be shocked if he's still able to be a helpful player for them long term, but I think I'm concerning myself less with the Fred VanVleet fit. Whereas I think Reed's going to fit with him anyways. Yeah, and I do believe that it's just a 1 year club option, I think, on the second year for that one. Right this second, it looks like a 2 year deal because he's playing so well for the Rockets. But I suspect he's not a core piece as far as what you're considering when you're making this pick. But I think James is right. I really like the defensive players that they have around Şengün. I worry about Jalen Green and Reed Shepherd a little bit, especially because I'm still doing film review on all these guys all the time. I'm still trying to learn more, and I've kind of come to the position on Reed where I am. I think the talk about how good he is on defense has swung a little too far. I just online, and maybe it's just who I'm seeing. I think his off-ball defense is his awareness is good and his strength is good. And strength is so important. It's such an underrated skill for him. But he's small. He is small. He's not that athletic. From a speed perspective, I know he's not that like from a speed perspective, and I do think he struggles to consistently stay locked in off ball. But one thing that I think is his offensive, how we talk about his offense is we're not giving him enough credit because the shooting's insane. It is. It's obviously insane. And we talk about him like he's not athletic, so maybe he won't be able to create. The problem is he's such a good shooter that you have to be in this freaking jersey. So it creates space. He doesn't have to be the fastest guy in the world. It almost doesn't matter. He's able to blow past guys all the time because they have to be so out on top of him, way out in space. So he creates his own leverage that way. The defender's off balance because they have to be so in his way all the time. He moves so well off ball to create space for the team. He is such a good passer. I mean, he's just was in such a bad spot in Kentucky playing with Dillingham and then them not running everything through him. I really think every time I watch him, I think, oh, okay, I see the star. I see the potential offensive star here. Like not even just a role player, but I absolutely see how it would work if he is going to improve the handle. Really, it's the handle for me. If he could really get a cleaner handle, man, he could be an offensive juggernaut. I'm so impressed. But defensively was the question. I like Ahmed. I like Tari. I like Jabari Smith out there. Three big switchy wings, especially Tari and Ahmed just being able to, scram little defenders out of the way, get over and around the screens, just being able to help cover for the weaknesses, just the speed and electric, movement of those guys. I think is really going to help Reed. And Reed's so strong. I think he's going to be able to hold up long enough just for a second to allow those superior athletes to get into help position. So I think that's really where you are. James, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do want to push back a little bit on the athleticism, and maybe it is that he's not athletic, but to me, with short arms and unathletic, a 2.5 block percentage just doesn't add up. Like there's got to be something else factoring in there, and maybe it just is that he has supernatural reflexes. But I think he does a really good job turning his hips on defense. He does get blown by. He's not an ideal on-ball point of attack defender, but he does a good job turning his hips and then getting back into play, staying in it. There's some guys who are dying on screens out here. One we may talk about in a minute here, who possibly was a teammate of Reed's. I don't know. As far as defensively, I do think that there's a little bit of functional athleticism that people aren't recognizing because obviously there's biases that play in and all that. But I think that he does enough that he's never going to be a liability because he's always trying to stay in the play. He's never just dying on the screen. He's never giving up. He's always going to, I think, stay in to where you can make the adjustment. Yeah, Chris, you had something you wanted to add to that. Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely agreed. And I don't mean to say he's a bad defender. I don't think that's true. I think he can hold up enough. And the steal block numbers are unfreaking believable. I almost can't explain it. It's so impressive. because his hands are so lightning quick and he's got such incredible hands. They're so good. Um, but yeah, I do think he's probably a liability at the next level a little bit, just because of the limited size. He's quite small, but I agree that I don't think, or at least on this team, I think he can hold up for sure. I think he can hold up long enough to get the recovery help from his team when there's so much athleticism. I'm with you. I understand.
Let me clarify there. I think if you use him incorrectly, he could absolutely be a liability. No doubt about that. If you say, hey, we saw you had these steal numbers in college, so go guard Steph Curry at the point of attack and get through those screens while we drop coverage. Yeah, he's going to be toast. Absolutely. So there is some nuance there. Absolutely. Alex, is there another prospect you wanted to touch on next?
Well, I think there's a prospect that the name has been thrown around, and I haven't seen it so much recently, but I think there's the Donovan Clingan question. And that presents itself in a number of ways. As Chris said, Jabari Smith has done a little bit more defensively, big body, guy who can do some things, has played a little bit of five this year. He played about a third of his minutes at the five. And of course, you have Shangoon, who has become this sort of hub that they run their offense through. He's a 5 assist a game guy this year. So you kind of have some fill in spots there. Clingan showed a lot of things, I think, especially in the tournament that people were excited about, how he can translate to the next level. But James, how do you see him fitting in with the rotation that already exists there? Because I think that was a question really early on for the draft. I think that was a name that got thrown around really early on. It's maybe tailed off a little, but I think it still sits there, and it sort of frames up the entire thing. Is we've got two guards, we've got two wings, we've got two bigs. So, who are we bringing in to accentuate the most of this talent? And I think Clingan's name still belongs in this list.
No, I do want to talk about those Jabari Smith at center minutes. I know Basketball Reference has him listed, I think 32% of his minutes at the center this season. Part of that Shingun went out. Part of that was Jock Landau was unplayable at the beginning of the season. And part of that was Basketball Reference not necessarily always realizing who's actually playing the center. I think they just go by height. A lot of the time, Jeff Green was actually the one guarding the center, surprisingly. So, and with them bringing on Steven Adams, also, I don't think Jabari Smith is going to see even 20%, let alone 30% of his minutes at the center. As far as Clingan's fit with the Rockets, do I think as a backup center he fits? Absolutely. Do I think that we want to bring a backup center in, the number 3 pick behind our franchise cornerstone? I think that at that point, you better be really convinced that they can play minutes together. I know Donovan's camp has been really selling hard. Hey, he's a shooter. He's a shooter. It's not something that I'm personally buying into. And his free throw numbers just don't point to him being a good 3-point shooter either. I'm not sold on Edey either being a good 3-point shooter, but I'd almost buy more into Edey being a shooter than Clingan. Now, again, I always hope I have to eat my words when I'm speaking negatively about players. Hopefully, Clingan comes in and he's a Brooke Lopez type player. That would be really cool. I don't see it happening. So I'm not in love with the fit of Clingan at the number 3 pick with the Rockets personally. I'm not sold on him being able to do anything but drop at an NBA level in the pick and roll, which to me is really tough to game plan around when you get to, the basketball we're seeing right now. If you're dropping the pick and roll, you're probably giving a good 3-point shooter an open look. Not something I'm super sold on, especially given that Shingun has his own flaws. If I'm going to bring a backup center in, I need him to be able to really cover the whole landscape of everything I need my center to do defensively when he's going to be spelling one of the top offensive centers in the league, I think. Because we know there's going to be an offensive drop-off.
Okay, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think there's the Clingan question was out there. It was early on. I felt like giving you the platform here to address it. It was good. Let's move on from that and talk about the wings. I think the NBA has become a wing game in the past 10 years. We've seen a lot of teams. The Boston Celtics are out there with 2 big wings. I think I said that to say this: you can never have too many good players who are playing kind of off the ball. I think there's a group of guys here that are, you entertain the question: is it Zealous? Is it Holland? Is it Connect? Is it Cody Williams? I think those 4 guys they all fit in different niches, and they all play sort of some 2-3, some 3-4. But I think they fit into what the modern construct of the NBA wing. Chris, is there any guy here that you feel like, really you really want to see get in with the talent that's already there? Or like I want to do this before I frame the question up for you. Like the Ron Holland thing is like hyper athlete. We went through the ups and the downs of Ron Holland a couple of weeks ago. Um, is there anybody that like really fits in with what they want to do, or can enhance the game in some way uh, in that group, or is it really more just like a talent play? Like, let's just grab a guy. We don't really know the fit here, but we're just going to get the best player on the board, which I think there's a good argument that if you're at number 3, Ron Holland might be the most talented, or BPA, if you're into that draft strategy. But I think with these different guys, you got some different looks here. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I do also want to say we're assuming Sarr and Riza Shea get taken, but it's very possible Riza Shea is here at this spot. So he's probably also on that list as one of these options. Um, I agree that Holland is kind of the BPA as far as the talent. What I think with this spot is because it just depends. If you're crazy about one of those guys, great. That's the fit, right? But for instance, I'm not crazy about any of them. I don't know. I'm not super confident that any of them is going to be a hit. So when we're talking about this team with 6 starters already, I think it's about getting someone who doesn't take something away, gives you options. And so then when you're talking Holland or Matas, the shooting numbers scare the heck out of me on a team like this because you don't want to take that away. You'd like to have a Holland because maybe something the Rockets are struggling with a little bit is having enough creators that are potential high level, like, running offense kind of guys. Maybe that's not an issue, and maybe we would don't think that's an issue in 2 years. I don't know. It could be that Amen gets so good at it, and they still have Van Fleet, and Jalen Green pops off and really levels up on as far as that, and then that's not an issue. But right now, I'm not super confident in that. So I think it's about not taking things away, and so that makes me want to shy away a little bit from Holland and Matas because of the shooting woes. Because I think Matas is a little bit more of a prospect, like a long-term prospect, as we've talked about in the past. This team, they want someone to come in and contribute. Because they're 2 years ahead of schedule. They want to get into the playoffs. They want somebody who can come in, walk in the door, and do something for the team on their first contract. And I'm not sure that Holland, who is a really good upside play because he's so young. I mean, he's a year younger than like half these guys, and has so much athleticism, but maybe just isn't there yet. Maybe that's not the best fit for them. Maybe Matas is the same thing. So I lean more towards the Riza Shea, towards the Cody Williams. Riza Shea is a little weird just because I don't know that he can guard out on the perimeter, but maybe it doesn't matter because they have Ahmed who can just do that. They have Tari who's so athletic, he can just kind of do that. So maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe you just want big athletic wings, and you could never have enough of those. Riza Shea is an incredible off-ball mover. His shot, is I think he can shoot. The numbers are so kind of all over the place for him. But Cody maybe, as we talked about in the past, I think Cody's kind of good at everything, so he probably takes a little less away and is going to be able to guard those smaller guards. It's length, it's speed. But yeah, I think I would lean Cody or Riza Shea. He's available. I think at this point over the more project kind of guys. What do you think, James?
Yeah, I think there's maybe 2 schools of thought you could follow if you're the Rockets here. We would already talk about hey, they have a lot of guys in their core they already believe in. So maybe, contrary to what I've been preaching, we look for best fit. Maybe you do take that upside swing where you say, hey, we have the luxury of taking a high swing on a guy that we can put in the G League for a few months, maybe even a whole year, depending on how he looks. I know with Cam Whitmore, they were surprised they got him at 20. He spent some time in the G League. He actually showed some pick and roll stuff that he hasn't really got a chance to show in the NBA yet. And I do think he gets insane tunnel vision, but that's another conversation. So I think the big upside swing you could make would be Ron Holland, obviously. If his shooting does pan out, suddenly you have an insanely talented player who's a physical specimen who really, next to Tari and Amen, would just really be scary. If I'm another team, I'm scared of those 3 if I'm coming down the court. So Holland, I think, is the big upside swing. If you want to take maybe a mid upside swing, someone who maybe develops some other tools that are useful, but already comes in, I think, expecting to maybe be someone who can contribute, maybe not year one, but you think he's going to be able to contribute immediately. Cody Williams, I like that name a lot. And then I think if you're just looking for, hey, we need a guy who can come in and contribute right away, Connect is the guy. He's a really good shooter. He has more experience at the college level, meaning I think he's going to be able to pick up the NBA terminology a little bit quicker than some of these younger guys. So, and again, he brings something the Rockets don't have but need shooting. Especially, he's able to kind of, and I think actually looking at his numbers, I wasn't super impressed with his off screen numbers, 56th percentile. So that's good, absolutely, especially given it was 19% of his offense, which is actually an insane number for off screen shooting points per possession. So, yeah, getting back to it, Connect I think is kind of the safe pick. So Holland, high upside, big swing. Cody Williams, we're going for the double. I think Connect is the single where you know what you're getting, less risk, but higher average payoff.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of like that. I think I'm probably find myself in the Ron Holland camp of like I said. I mean, I know this is painting with a broad brush, but like big wings are valuable and they're a market inefficiency, and not everybody's got a bunch of them, and the Rockets already do. And I think I probably want to swing for, you know, this is the third pick in the draft, but we've covered this countless times, and this will be covered countless times again before the actual draft. This is not a normal draft. This is a draft where the best player in this draft is the fifth best player in another draft. But at the same time, going back to a point that I just want to continue to harp on here is that this is it. This is what you get. And I think this is their one last bite at the apple of that huge upside, which is not to say Dalton Connect couldn't come in and be an amazing day one contributor. But I think from my perspective, as I look down this list, I think Holland might be my favorite guy here, just because he's huge. He can do all these things. And maybe we've got Ime Udoka, who has shown this just penchant for developing guys and making them lock in and care defensively. Maybe we could see something out of Ron Holland in that sphere because he's just so physically talented. And if that were the case, man, I mean, of course, that's projecting 3-4 years down the line. But man, if you saw Ron Holland become a really good point of attack defender, and work tremendously hard to add that to his game in a world where he doesn't have to be a bad first option where he's jacking up shots. He can really focus in on a singular role and contribute within the confines of his skill set as it continues to develop. That's a guy I think I really like here in this spot. The Cody Williams piece of this is interesting. I think, James, you're a little bit higher on him than I am, but nonetheless, I do see there's a lot of multi-tool talent there, and I think that's a guy that they would like here as well. But it's really tough getting back to the, Chris, you and I both had said 6 starters. I think when I started going through it, I was looking at a minute ago, maybe it's 7 starters. Maybe the guy they bring in is an 8th starter. So there aren't enough minutes to go around. I think there's some consolidation that has to come into play. But to me, it's like, well, okay, let's just grab this guy who's physically gifted, who's got some pretty good tools, like in terms of what he can do, but certainly can be improved. And then let's just get to work and see what happens.
I want to ask one question to you both before we move on. I want to go back really quickly to Donovan Clingan. Is there a planet in the future where the Rockets can play Donovan Clingan, Şengün, and Amen Thompson? Is that even a thing that can happen in the playoffs? Last week we talked about in our last podcast, you know, why would you draft a player who can't play in the finals? Well, why would you put together a team that can't play in the finals? Why would you put together a rotation like that? So I just I hear the Donovan Clingan stuff, and that's all I can think.
Yeah, I just don't think so. I mean, I think the multifaceted approach of the NBA is having at least 4 guys who can shoot, and if the 5th guy can't shoot, he can do a lot of other things. I think the Rockets are sort of bordering on that with currently Amen Thompson, who, Chris, you said maybe will never be a shooter, and So I think they've got a guy that they already want to develop as like, if we're going to play a non-shooter, it's going to be this guy because he does every other thing on the floor. And I think you're right. Like bringing Klingon into that, man, that's just tough. There's no space where that works. Now, the defensive question about that is like, well, okay, well, what do you want from your four spot? If you're going to go with somebody, do you want somebody who is like a Tari Eason, or do you want like a Jabari Smith, or do you want to find a spot up guy, or what do you want to do with it? And I think, like, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not smart enough to know, but I think to the question itself, it's like, man, if we can't play three guys in a rotation, what are we going to do? And like, and then, like James said, like, okay, let's throw Steven Adams in there too, who we know can play in the playoffs. Let's throw in a couple more guys here and there. So they already are sort of bumping up against this non-shooter quota that I think that number is pretty low in the modern NBA. And we've seen that develop in this playoffs. It's like, there are just guys who you can't play, and maybe you can play one of them. James, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question, but I think that we almost already saw it solved this season. At the beginning of the year, I think Shingun and Thompson had a little bit of rough edges in terms of where their games met. Now they adapted to that. They figured a way to make it work. As you mentioned earlier, Thompson got really good in that dunker spot. And then when Shingun went out, they also started screening with Thompson a little bit more. He got he gained confidence in that short roll to the elbow, kind of that Draymond play make from there type role offensively. I just don't see how you could possibly fit another big in there. Klingon is a good passer. I don't think that that's a weakness of his by any means, but passing can only make up for lack of shooting to a certain degree. Like at the end of the day, some teams are just going to start packing the paint against you, especially come playoff time. And I think you're 100% right. If you pick Klingon, you're setting yourself up to where you either have to move one of Klingon or Shingun, or you just don't have a team that can compete in the finals successfully.
I mean, I think we want to throw the Dillingham question out here. Like, that's a name that continually comes up, and I'm not necessarily advocating for it, but I think in order for us as content creators to do our due diligence, we got to throw the Dillingham name out there. And I think that starts and ends with the question that we talked about with Reed Shepherd. Dillingham's smaller than Reed Shepherd. And so what do you do with him? Could you bring him in? He's certainly not somebody who would be on my list for this roster, just for that exact reason. Defensive questions are too huge, and I think you guys like him maybe more than I do. I think he kind of is just not an Ime Udoka guy. But it's a name I've seen tied around. Like, I don't know how hard he's going to work. As you said, James, like, he dies on screens. Is he going to fight through them? This is an Ime Udoka like point of emphasis. Is there anything here that like I mean, obviously we're going to examine the Dillingham thing, but is there anything here like that needs to be really dissected, or is it just kind of a bad fit?
I think offensively, the fit is actually like awesome next to someone like Thompson, who can really, if he gains that ball handling skills, can be on ball and just have a deadly outside shooter. And also he can play in the screening role with Thompson screening with him. Shingun, I think he's going to be good at doing handoffs. But what it really comes down to is he an Ime type player? And you correctly identified he is not an Ime type player defensively. I'm going to be honest. I haven't seen enough of Ime offenses to know what an Ime type player is offensively. But defensively, I have a pretty good idea of it. And I don't think he passes the bar. I think that he is maybe more of a piece for a team that is still looking for how they're going to be generating their offense. Not the offense of the Rockets was good again at the top of the show. They were 20th. But I think there's solvable ways to fix that offensive issue without adding someone who could potentially be a huge liability on defense. And I say this fully knowing that some people are saying the same things about Reed, that he's going to be this liability on defense. And that's just difference of opinion at the end of the day. I don't know if there's anyone with a difference of opinion on that with Rob. I think 95% of people are probably in that camp, and the other 5% of the people might have the last name Dillingham. I don't know. So as far as I'm concerned, I probably wouldn't go with Rob with the Rockets, but that doesn't mean I don't think he's going to not be a good player. I just think that this isn't necessarily the right fit for him. And when it comes to players like this, and really most players, fit matters a ton for whether they succeed. The big superstars, they're going to succeed wherever they go. I don't think there's a lot of those in this draft, so I think fit matters a lot more in this draft than in most drafts. I get a lot of pushback a lot of time. this guy isn't a guy you pick at number 3. Well, maybe not last year, maybe not in the 10 years prior, but this year he might be. Chris, what are your thoughts on Rob?
The Rockets were 21st in spot ups, 23rd in transition, 29th in ISO, 25th off screens, 23rd in catch and shoot, and 22nd in 3-point percentage. Rob Dillingham will improve all of those if he is in a situation where he has the opportunity to do so. I like Dillingham as an offensive player. I think Ime has done such a good job crafting a good defense around Alperen Şengün, who I love as a player, but is not a great defensive player, that introducing a defensive player of the quality of Rob Dillingham, I think really threatens the balance. So despite that, I agree with you, James, that I think he would be a good offensive fit and an awesome offensive fit potentially. I really worry about the balance. They're so built on the defense around Şengün, around the hub of Şengün, that I certainly worry about it. I think if you were to be ready to move on from Jalen Green for sure, I'd feel better, because I don't think Dillingham, Green, and Şengün playing big minutes I don't think you can maintain the balance. I just don't. I don't think with that kind of guard size. But if you were going to tell me, yeah, they're for sure moving on from Jalen Green, and it's now we're going to play Dillingham, Amen, Tari, Jabari Smith, and Şengün, I'd feel better. Maybe Dillingham or Van Fleet in that first spot. But since I don't know that, I'm not thrilled about it. And I think really it's going to be about fitting around Şengün for now. Just until we have more information. And again, we're ahead of schedule here with the Rockets, so I still feel like we're missing information on who these players are going to be. Some of them, and as much as I love Dillingham, it's just as an offensive player, I'm so worried about the balance of the team. I think it's really, really important.
So there's two questions I want to get, like, as we kind of close this out to answer. Number one, and I'll answer them as well, but I want to get your take on it. James, I'll start with you on this one. Can the Rockets draft a starter in this draft? They have the number 3 pick in the draft, which is something conventionally you would think we're going to draft someone who's going to play 65, 82, whatever metric you want to use, games and start for us. Is that a player that you see anywhere in this draft that they can draft a starter at number 3?
Yeah, I do think that there's a player, not immediate starter, because they're not going to be moving on from Jalen Green or Fred VanVleet or Dylan Brooks immediately, barring a Donovan Mitchell or Mikal Bridges trade, I think. So not immediately, but I think in the long run, yes. Reed Shepard, I think, is, if you were to move on from Jalen Green and Fred VanVleet's contract eventually ended, if you had a starting lineup of Amin Thompson, Reed Shepard, Tari Eason, Jabari Smith, and Alperen Şengün, with Cam Whitmore coming off the bench as your spark plug, that's a solid 6. That really, you're just plugging in the 7, 8, 9 spot at that point, filling it out, and I think you have a really competitive roster in 3-4 years. So my answer is yes. And I don't think Reed is necessarily the only potential starter pick, but I'm just giving one name out.
Chris, what about you? Is there a guy that you think this guy can start, this year? I think the question's this year, but like down the road, as James said, do you see a starter being able to be picked at number 3?
This year's tough because I think they're still trying to figure out who all these more developed guys are. So I don't know that there's someone who is going to start, unless Dylan Brooks really just can't play, unless Hari, maybe the shooting numbers aren't solid over the course of the year. I know he doesn't start for them, but when he, with Şengün, Jabari Smith, it's going to be Fred, it's going to be Amen, potentially Amen, whatever ends up happening with the Dylan Brooks thing. Is it possible? If Cody Williams comes in and really shoots, I think that's possible. If Reza Shea comes in and really shoots, I think that's possible. One of these wings, that's I would think the only way this year, even though I think Reed is such a great fit. It would be tough to see him starting for the Rockets in this current iteration with VanVleet, with Jalen Green already on the roster. So I would be pretty surprised if anyone but one of the wings, if they're really shooting well, is a starter this year. I mean, even Klingon, like hypothetically, if you thought let's play big for a while, you'd have to really, I mean, that means Ahmed's not playing. That means you're playing Van Fleet, Green. I don't, I guess Jabari Smith, Alfred Şengün, and Klingon. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that that's like really what you want. So I think it would have to be one of the shooters for an immediate fit, one of the wings.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to add too much to that because I think you guys nailed it. It's like 2 years down the road, you're drafting someone who's going to fit in. Maybe as we solve the Jabari Smith question about what position he's going to play, or solve the Jalen Green question, is he even going to be on the roster? I think, yeah, you start to see those guys get slotted in, but I can't imagine there's going to be somebody who's going to start 40 plus games coming out of this draft. So that kind of brings me to the second question. Who's the guy? You're on the clock. Let's just say for a moment that Alexander Sarr and Reese Ashe are gone. Chris, who you taking? Time's ticking on the clock.
It's going to be Reed. I think he's the best fit. I love the add in the shooting. I think the 50th percentile outcome isn't a star offensive player, but I think it's a really good offensive player. And I think there is a world in which he, as weird as it is, becomes a really, really high level offensive player in the NBA while not being a huge liability on defense, especially on this team who can really cover him for his weaknesses better than maybe other defensive teams can. So yeah, I think Reed's the guy for all the reasons we've outlined before.
All right, James, what about you, resident Rockets expert? Time is ticking on the clock. You got to make your choice. Who do you want?
Well, I know that a lot of people have been wondering this because I haven't made my thoughts clear on this by any means since November. But Reed Shepard's obviously the guy I'm going to go with. There's for all the reasons we've already said. Defensively, I think that his issues are a little bit overstated, and offensively, he's just maybe he won't end up being a generational shooter. I'm not saying that it's guaranteed he does that, but I think it's almost guaranteed he's going to be a good shooter. So for that reason, and maybe this is me trying to beckon back to Rockets old days, but I think the type of impact he can make for a championship team is Robert Horry. Like, not the way he's making it, I'm not saying he's going to play like Robert Horry, but he can be that type of player, I think, to a championship caliber team, a Robert Horry. So I'm going Reed Shepard.
I guess that puts me on the spot for the last pick. And you know what? I'm going to be different. And this is not just to be different for the sake of content. I think if I'm on the clock there and I'm looking at that list of names, knowing what we know and knowing how little we know and the variability of this draft, I think I'm going to take Ron Holland. I think it's a wing-driven game. I think the size question becomes a market inefficiency that the Rockets can tap into. Now we're huge at 2, 3, and 4. Now we can play a lineup where we've got a guy like an Amen Thompson playing the 4, and we run the floor, and we're hard to defend, and teams can't really switch us because we're huge, or they have to play outside of their own comfort zone. Maybe I'm going to be the GM of the three of us who gets fired first. But I'm just looking at it and knowing how important size is, which is not to say you guys are wrong, because the shooting aspect is troublesome. But I think if I'm looking at somebody, I still want to take one more shot at somebody who's got potential to be an all-star caliber player, and can bring something dimensionally that is going to give us that market inefficiency that you need to win an NBA Finals. And I think Ron Holland is a guy like, if it's really time to clock's ticking, I think that's the guy I'm probably just going to put here. And I will kind of hold to that platform throughout the draft. Is like, I think Ron Holland fell too far. And I think that there's a little bit of a market correction of, he was in a terrible situation. He shouldn't have been doing the things he did. But what I like about the Rockets is he's got a really defined role. He can come in. He's got a coach who's going to stay on him consistently about defensive effort, who can improve the things. And so maybe like I said, maybe I get fired. I don't know.
No, I think that's a perfectly defensible position. Like I said, I think there's two trains of thought. Big upside swing or the best fit. Most drafts I go big upside. This draft I feel a little bit differently. But that does it for this episode of the Ahead of the Game podcast. Please make sure to subscribe and share our channel so we can continue to grow if you enjoy our content, and have a great day.